I just got to, if you talk to me, Cliff, I don't know. I wish I could.
I'm sure glad you're here, and I hope that you enjoy the afternoon. We'll have the reading of the minutes, please.
The Clinton County Historical Society met on Saturday, January 9th. The Clinton County Historical Society met on Saturday, January 9th in the community room at the courthouse with 22 members in attendance. The meeting was called to order at 2 o'clock by Karma Kay, president. The minutes of the last meeting were read and approved. The new president, Karma Kay, opened the meeting by thanking all who had assisted with the open house on December 6th. She stated that she thought one of our major objectives should be an inventory of all of the items in the museum and a permanent record established identifying the donor of each item and or the origin. It was revealed that the Perkins furniture in the parlor was purchased for $600 and the desk was from the Bohart Banking House. This was referred to the property committee. Johnny Lee was appointed to the property committee to fill the vacancy created by the death of Wilbur Shoemaker. Dorothy Hoskins resigned as registered agent for the state, and Shirley Stoll was appointed to fill this vacancy. Louise Scarce, treasurer, reported we now have a total of 111 memberships. 2 new life members have been enrolled and 3 new memorials. Memorial plaques have been ordered. The Christmas tree on display during the open house was won by Mrs. Dawn Smith. Today's program consisted of a, quote, show and tell, unquote, by members.
And any corrections or additions to the minutes? The minutes stand approved as read. We don't have a treasurer's report, do we? Anybody?
Not that I know.
Louise has been working very faithfully on membership drive, and we're in the black. But we're just like a child before Christmas. We want lots of things, so we'll be spending some of that. Shirley Stoll has some nice donations and membership, and I know the committee has been working very active. You know, our year starts in September, and so by next September, our membership for this year will be out. We hope that you all are members. If you aren't, we welcome you. We welcome you to our programs, whether you are a member or just a visitor. More the merrier. Is there any old business? I have a few letters I'm going to just mention hurriedly, and if you're interested, you can see me then later. I have one here from Boonville, and they're having a tour. And of course, they mentioned a discount for groups, but we won't be going as a group. But it is in the spring, and they're going to have the highway bridge over the Missouri River at Boonville, and it's the Bridge to the Pass Historic Homes Tour. If anyone's interested in going to Boonville, that's in May the 30th, April the 30th, and May the 1st. And then we have a letter saying that there's a curator's society that would be interested in receiving any published newspapers or any papers of any kind before the year 1877. So if you're interested in something like that, you let me know. Then I had a nice letter from a man in Colorado, and he says, I have in my possession an original copy of the Church Constitution of the Baptist Church of Jesus Christ, which is dated the 4th Saturday of August, 1843. The document was signed in what appears to be Grand River, Clinton County, Missouri. I'm not sure the exact location, as some of the writing is hard to decipher, and he tells some of the people that are on it. Most of them are Hardens. They are my ancestors. They suggested, I went to the courthouse to see if I could find out anything about if there was a city Grand River, and no one at the courthouse seemed to know, and they suggested I write to the state society. Would anybody have any information to give to me on this? Well, I'll follow up the best I can. And then I have a letter trying to trace a Paisley P-A-I-S-L-E-Y or P-A-S-L-E-Y family. One was born in July 1883, Lathrop Township, daughter of Joseph Paisley, age 28, and Julia Thomas Paisley. Our society hasn't worked too much in genealogy. I'm interested in it, and Christine McNeil is interested, so if anybody has anything to comment on those letters, let me know afterwards. And then we have a letter from the Plattsburgh Board of Education asking us to come to the meeting, which was Thursday night, wasn't it? It's Tuesday night. Which way? It's already passed. It was Tuesday night. At 8:30 about the election. So I hope that you're all informing yourself about what the board is proposing. New business. Anyone have any new business? The property committee have okayed asking Alice Smith to again mow the yard at $20 a time. Is there any objection to her doing that? Louise said she did a nice job last year, and Johnny and I talked last night, so if it's no objections, we'll ask her to mow again. She did last year. If there's anyone interested in trade.
Now this is one of the silk types that was made Victorian times, probably about 1880. And as near as I can tell, the pattern on this one would be called furrow. And this was donated to us by...
It's a regular log cabin.
yeah, but the log cabin had lots of different patterns, is what I'm saying. It's a log cabin quilt, but they did courthouse steps and all different kinds of patterns. And this one I think is called straight furrow. And it was donated to us by Mrs. Black. It was Josephine Williams. It was in Josephine's things. And the kids thought it would be nice if the Historical Society would have it. And it really isn't, it's just very, very typical of the times. It's done in silk and it's tacked through because these quilts all got their strength from the way that they're put together. So they really were never, again, quilted. They were sewed together little strips, and that's how they got that's where their strength comes from. But she gave us this, and I think we should write her a nice note and thank her for it.
Margaret will do that.
And Alice Black said that she was sure that this had not been in her family, but came through Josephine's family. And it was not one that was made by Josephine because it's too old to have been made by Josephine. So she thought maybe that Mrs. Fowler had originally made it. But she didn't really know, but she knew that it wasn't from their family.
How old did you say it was?
It's, she didn't have any idea, but just because of the material it's made of and the way it's made, it was Victorian, it's probably about 1880. So, now I'll take it home, keep it till we go to the museum or whatever you want to do. Is that all right? And we can either put it in a case or fix some way to display it. Very nice gift.
I have Alice's address, Margaret, if you don't. In the property.
First, I would like to mention that in 2 months, our next meeting, the second Saturday of May, we will be having a program. A lady from Weston will be joining us to tell us about the museums. Today, we are pleased to have with us Anna Mae Grant, her husband Bill Grant, Douglas Fagan, and Ross Holland, who are going to tell us a little bit of history on Lathrop and the Mules.
Good. Got to have some help so you fellas get up here.
We're all right here.
No. Come over here.
Don't hide behind this map.
Atta girl.
Well, this is my husband, Bill Grant, and don't hide behind the map. This is Douglas Fagan, and he has worked in Plattsburgh. I'm sure you know him. And Mr. Ross Holland, from attorney. Whoops. How do I do that? Well, maybe I should put this somewhere. This is a map map of Lathrop and the surrounding area where all the barns were built, so I got to have it up here. Eventually, I'll put all the pictures.
Wonder if it would sit on top of the
Maybe
TV.
here, how about this?
Good idea.
That's a good idea. That'll stay. Well, it's very exciting to see so many people at the historical meetings. We don't usually have this many. I don't know if this is the reason, but Lathrop has quite a history, and we're going to try to tell you a little bit about it. On any given Friday or in the fall, during football season or during the basketball season, you'll see young people running around in jackets and sweaters and sweat jerseys with mules all over them. And our school has mule stationery and all sorts of interesting things that shows that the mules of yesteryear have not been forgotten. And in their parades, they always have a donkey or a mule head or maybe a mule's tail or whatever in the parades to make it interesting. And in their school, all of their school programs, they have mule tracks here and mule tracks there. And just recently, we won the state tournament for basketball, and it was really quite interesting that Lathrop made such a trip with the insignia here. And we might have won it again this year had it not been for Plattsburgh. They kind of did us in. But anyway, I just wanted to say that the mules have not been forgotten over the years, but it has been almost a century since the Guyton and Harrington Mule Company was formed. And I'm going to give you a little history of that because there's so many facts and figures here, and then these able men are going to try to tell us a few more interesting facts. The Guyton and Harrington Mule Company was formed in the late 1800s by two cousins, Mr. J.D. Guyton and Mr. W.R. Harrington. Mr. Guyton first dealt with horses and mules in the South, in the states of Mississippi and Alabama. And then he came to Missouri to buy stock for the cotton farmers. And he realized the potential for a lucrative business with the beautiful bluegrass and the abundance of water around Lathrop. In 1880, then, they formed the company, which lasted for the next 30 to 35 years. During the Boer War, which was in 1901 and 1902, they gained worldwide fame for the expert management and the shipping of large numbers of horses and mules to South Africa. The British Remount Commission, sent here by their government, did the overseeing and the choosing of the best stock for the purpose intended. And with this enormous business they had created, it took 500 buyers spanning the nation to choose the desired stock and to arrange shipping back to Kansas City and into Lathrop. The three railroads that were used to ship the stock from Kansas City to Lathrop was the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe, the Burlington, and the Rock Island. And there were trains every 15 minutes coming through Lathrop. And each rail company had spurs to these different farms. Like here's a main railroad, here is another one. And then they'd have spurs sent out to some of these farms to unload the cattle, or not cattle, I keep wanting to call them cattle, mules. My husband's been correcting me all week. The mules and the horses. The British Remount Commission was made up of 24 men and 10 officers. Some of them were doctors of veterinary, and their job was to care for and to detect any diseases that these animals might contract. And a common disease of the animals were glanders. And to keep them from spreading this to South Africa, they employed the Mule test to all animals purchased. And it was a simple test, and the value of it was to find it in its initial stage. Since Guyton and Harrington had vast holdings here and in Kansas City, St. Louis, Nashville, and Columbia, Tennessee, and Chalmette, Louisiana. The shipping of these animals, it meant that they were never off company land until they came to the port of embarkation. They would allow them to go to the next city and rest and water them and feed them on to the next and to the next, and they were never off company land. Although the reputation of Guyton and Harrington was well established at this time, it was during World War I that they grew to such large proportions. In 1914, the British government was searching among their files and found the name of Guyton Harrington again after having dealt with them during the Boer War. And they contacted the company and ordered 1,500 cavalry horses. It was a satisfactory transaction, and that was the beginning of the sale of thousands of horses and mules and the passing of these four-footed animals through Lathrop and on to Europe. It is said about 1/2 of the number of animals used in World War I were shipped from this country came from this area. Colonel Guyton, in one of his personal interviews, said the total number was approximately 350,000 animals. Because of Missouri's central location and Lathrop's fine bluegrass land and sufficient water supply, they had to build, because of the growth of this, they had to build more barns and hospital barns and blacksmith shops, and then they acquired 15,000 acres of land. Now this is Lathrop. This red area is Lathrop, and all these farms that have been rented and leased amounted to 15,000 acres, and it was put to use with this huge amount of animals. 20 large mule and hay barns in all. Starting here is number 1, and we go on around to this number, and I'll pass this around or you may look at it later. It was the 20 mule barns and the hay barns meant that the activity around Lathrop established a record never previously seen in world history. At one time, it was said that there were 53,000 head of horses and mules assembled in and around the town in these additional, in all these barns. And so they were required to build additional sheds and barns and kitchens and storerooms and grain and hay warehouses and many more things in order to accommodate them. No less than 300 carpenters were kept busy. A large lumber yard was established, and gangs of men were hired to handle the tremendous task. Each animal had to be tagged, and always British officers were on hand to organize and aid in the work. Train loads of hay arrived regularly from every point of the compass. 12 men were constantly touring the country buying hay. More hay was bought than was really needed at all times, but because of the submarine menace during the war, several loads of animal and hay were lost to the ocean. So Guyton and Harrington's had to keep plenty on hands, and they were always prepared. They could always come up with some more. With this many animals, there was bound to be a need for hospital care. A large hospital barn was built, and they had more than one. Here, where there's red crosses here, those are all hospital barns. And this is down around Converse, and this is east of, west of Lathrop, on the way to Plattsburgh, and all of this blue is water that they needed for watering the animals. A large hospital barn was built, and the British government sent the most skilled veterinarians and horse judges to choose and to care for them. One of the veterinarians, a Dr. McLean, was Bill's uncle, and he was sent here from Montreal, Canada. The hospital accommodations were exceptionally fine, with exercise lots and baths holding heated water into which a sick horse or a mule was led. And they had cookers to furnish cooks especially prepared food. Sounds rather plush life for a mule. A large force of men were required to help with the roundup or the moving of these animals from one pasture to another. And 100 horsemen called the Chigo gang, or the Chigger gang as they were nicknamed, took care of this enormous task. The feeding and the watering was also a huge task. Sometimes as many as 17,000 head would be on hand, and immense storage sheds or buildings housed these, and they were all iron covered, metal covered I would say, and when they erected them they built them well. One of these barns was as large, the dimensions is 496 feet long and 85 feet wide. And when filled to capacity, there was 400 railroad cars held. It was the same as 400 railroad cars or 4,800 tons of hay. That's a lot of hay. Feeding time was a scene long to be remembered. There were more than 100 wagons, many pulled by 4-horse teams, and twice the number of men to place the feed in the troughs and the racks. Of course, the watering task was similar in scope. So extensive was the water supply that it required 1,250 troughs and the necessity of using 20 miles of 2-inch pipe to carry water from the supply tanks. In some places, streams were dammed up by a concrete structure and artificial lakes were formed. In other places, artesian wells were tapped and gasoline pumping stations or windmills were used to supply the water. The main office was located right on the Burlington Railroad, right in the town of Lathrop, and it had lots of holding pens there to load the animals, and there was also a commissary at this particular location. In these holding pens that they had, they would hold about 1,000, and with 2 loading pens and 3 chutes each, they could load or unload an entire train of 30 cars, each holding 75 animals in 30 minutes, which sounds impossible to me. As cleanliness was essential to the animals and their health and their well-being, a washing stand was located at this property, and when the work teams and the saddle horses came in from their day's labor, each was given a bath, and the windmills and the gasoline-powered pumps supplied the pressure that was needed to hose them down. Washing time was indeed a busy and an interesting scene. It took a lot of horseshoes and mule shoes to take care of these animals, and they had blacksmith shops located in several places. And Bill has a little story about horseshoes he'll tell you. The British officers, several of them, brought their wives. I think some of them stayed at the Mule Hotel in Kansas City, but several of them also lived around Lathrop. And one for sure we know lived on the Bonham Farm. And Mary Jo being an assessor, I know you'll know where the Bonham Farm is. That is east of Lathrop. And another one, Colonel Dredge and his wife lived in a house just behind where the 5 cross houses are now. It was a very large, rather desirable house at that time. It's been torn down since then, but Colonel Dredge and his wife lived there. And we sort of imagine that there was quite a nice social life during that time. Not very much is recorded about that, but we do have a few people who remember a few things. And this house was next to Judge John A. Cross's home, and the elite of Lathrop and the English people had their little tea-sipping parties and dances. And the Judge Cross's house had a ballroom on the 3rd floor, so we just can imagine they had a pretty nice time in their leisure. The firm of Guyton and Harrington ended around 1900 or 1920, And Mr. Harrington continued on in the business, but Mr. Guyton retired to the Mule Balk, I think. He lived there. Seemed to be a rather nice place to live because that seemed to be where he chose to live. And the Harringtons took the land and Mr. Guyton took the cash. That's the way they settled it. And for several years afterwards, Mr. Harrington carried on the mule and horse business. And at one time, he held a parade of all his machinery, which was a mile long. It was from the north end of the lake to the south end of the lake. I guess he was sort of proud of that, so he had a parade. And the Harringtons lived on the house and the ranch that is now the McGinnis farm on 116. And I was out there just the other afternoon, and they still have the water tower that fed the water to the house, or supplies the water to the house, and they're still using it. And this windmill's still standing. I don't think it's working. There are very few heirs left. Virginia Harrington Potter, who was a granddaughter of Mr. W.R. Harrington, just passed away last week. And she has a sister. There's a sister living yet in California, Hope Brooks, and she has a daughter and a son. And they would be great-grandchildren. And the great-granddaughter is here right now, and Maria Harrington asked her to come today, that she had other plans. And Guyton Carkener, who is a grain broker in Kansas City and has a seat on the trade, is a nephew of Mr. Guyton, of Mr. Frank Guyton, I believe, isn't he? He's a nephew of Frank. And a grandson. Oh, yes, he'd be a grandson.
Speak up a little, Lamb, when this thing runs.
I'm talking as loud as I can. I don't know what you're going to do when these men start to talk. They don't talk very loud. Mr. Guyton Carkener is a grandson of Mr. W.R., is that right? J.D., I'm getting, there's some more. Now, Mr. Ross Holland's father was a buyer for the Mule Company, and although he was a small boy, in fact, none of us are old enough to qualify to really be talking about this much. I wasn't even born, and he was not very far behind. And well, Douglas maybe has a few years on us, and Bill, but we are sort of telling you what we know and what we've heard and what we've read out of this book. Oh, the book is over there. That is a recopy of the original Guyton Harrington book that they put out. I don't know if it was for promotional purposes, but Mr. Holland has an original book, but this has been copied by Mr. Bradley, isn't that his name? The two college professors down at University of Missouri, Melvin Bradley, has recopied this book, and he sells it for $25, and he also has two more here, books on mules. And if you're interested in buying, which I doubt anybody would, unless you're terribly interested in mules, why, you can buy those. Ross, would you like to tell us about your father selling and buying? First he bought them and then he helped sell them, did he? He did both, so he's going to tell you a little bit about that. And then he'll also tell you about some of the traits of mules and some of their little quirks and funny little things they do. You want to stand up or you want to sit down?
My legs are
Okay, all right.
My father worked for them, both on buying and the showing, what they called, the way they sold them, they called it showing to the British government. And Dad worked in St. Louis and bought in St. Louis and sold in St. Louis, at East St. Louis, Illinois. And he worked at Lathrop, and he bought mules and horses all over the country, from here to Oregon. In 1916, we spent the summer there. I was a small kid, but I remember quite a bit of it. And he spent you never knew from one day to the next hardly where he'd be. They tell him be in St. Louis in the morning. That's how much notice he had.
How would he get there? By train?
By train.
By train.
The train made,
So,
we just made from there.
haven't had a train in Lathrop, so.
And that's about all there was about that side of it. Two traits for the mule is that, which a lot of people don't realize. And today they're using a lot of mules as saddle mules. More so in the south than anywhere. They hunt on them. They'll jump a fence, 4.5, 5 foot fence, just for fun.
Are they stubborn? Are they really stubborn?
No,
like they
they're
say?
not stubborn. They're smarter than anybody's horse.
They're smart.
And they could also stand more work, hard work, that's the reason. They used them more. They originated in Spain, the mule did. I'll bring that point up. And that's where they first started. With the mule was in Spain. Of course, it's a hybrid. It's a cross between the donkey and the horse. Which I suppose most of you know, part of you might not. But that's where they originate from.
Could you tell them, they employed quite a few colored people to handle, in fact, many, to handle these mules, and they had to break them. Didn't all those mules have to be broken before they were shipped?
No,
So
they were both broken before they bought them.
before they bought them.
Yeah, they didn't buy
Now,
it.
that they did
Bought
employ,
nothing that wasn't broken.
they did employ a lot of colored people. Tell them about Miller Hardin. We had one
It's
old
colored
colored man who
fella.
was,
Mr. Guyton was down in east Kansas City here in Missouri. This old big colored boy was catching those mules with his bare hand. There wasn't a mule living, and he couldn't. Some way or another, he'd get a hold of that ear on it, twist it, catch him with the nose, and stand there and hold it, and they couldn't move.
and if he didn't get
If
it
they
with his
didn't go
hands,
if they got a little too hard up on him, they'd just reach over and chew him on the ear.
I don't. That's man bites donkey, isn't it?
That's what happened. Anybody that was around later very much knew who Miller Hardin was.
He was a
What did Mr. Guyton tell him about? What did Mr. Guyton have to say to him?
Guyton said to him, he said, well, the way he said, nigger, what are you making here? He said, $40 a month. Mr. Guyton says, I'll give you twice that to come to work for me for the rest of your life. So during the Depression, other people working around that way, drawing $30 a month, he still drew his 80.
until he died, he was still on Guyton's
Oh, yeah.
payroll.
That payroll.
He was strong and loyal, and they stayed with it. I think that's
I
interesting.
think that's about all I have to say.
Okay, Bill, would you like to tell about, no, I got it.
I'll tell her.
Whatever it was.
There was many,
to speak up now.
okay. There was many stories about Guyton and Harrington, of course. The one that impressed me, a fellow came to town, he's a salesman, and it had been 25 years past, and he was telling me the story. He said that he went down to Mr. Guyton's office and had an audience with him. And Mr. Guyton said, young man, what are you selling? He said, I was selling horseshoes. Well, he said, can you furnish us with 3 carloads of horseshoes? And he said, I sure can. And he said, how would you like those shipped, Mr. Guyton? He said, the fastest way possible. Well, he said, I was being a little smart. I said, well, that'd be parcel post. He said, ship them that way. And he said he knew that was the largest parcel post order ever shipped. 3
they're-
carloads of
And they're
horseshoes.
shipped in kegs. I guess maybe you might have known that. I didn't. That many kegs of horseshoes, how much would the bill be for the parcel post? I can't imagine. And Bill, you were going to tell about the large barn. Now, we have a picture here of the largest barn in the world, and this was in the Ripley's Believe It or Not column.
That's not the barn.
Well, that is, you were going to tell about the hay barn.
Hay barn.
Okay,
It was
so-
the largest hay barn in the world.
Yeah,
Mr. Guyton was on the Board of Trade, and he cornered the hay market and demanded shipment because he needed the hay. And they got trains from all Montana, all over the country, and brought them in, and they had a switch engine. Stayed there night and day and unloaded this hay. And they came in so fast, they used the hay for scaffolding and built a barn around it. And the barn was a block long and a half a block wide. And so it was the largest hay barn in the world.
Now, Douglas, would you like to tell about how they disposed of the animals once they died, went to heaven?
I think most of it has already been said.
You know that.
Huh? Well, Guyton and Harrington, horse and mule made lots of tracks in Lake. I remember a good many things that happened. I was 11 years old when they first came there, and I had a pony that I drove to a buggy and rode around town. And I know my folks were always scared when I left with that pony, for fear some of the horses would break loose as they drove them through town. They drove them through in bunches and would stampede and they'd run over them. But I was around some. But they used to drive them through Lathrop when they moved them from one farm to another, one place to another. And they went across people's yards and their gardens and everything else as they did. And they stampeded sometimes. And it was quite a deal.
Was that what the Chigger gang was for, to keep them
That's
in
what
line?
they did. They took care of those.
Raised a lot of dust too, didn't they?
And my folks had a farm north of town, and they rented 120 acres of it to Guyton and Harrington for horses and mules because there was a spring there and the water ran through it and it furnished plenty of water. And I can remember being out there, at that place and seeing many dead horses laying around. They died by the hundred, that's a fact. And they couldn't get rid of them. In the hot weather, it was pretty bad. And I don't know just what year, but they built a cook plant down southeast of Lakewood, right north of the old Rat Inn schoolhouse on the Santa Fe Railroad. And they cooked those horses and got the grease out of them to make soap. But that was such a terrible thing for Lakewood because the wind was generally in the southeast and it nearly run everybody out of Lakewood. And it didn't last very long. And then another person that took care of some of the horses and mules that died was Charlie Tillman. And he had a little farm at southeast side of Lathrop. And they took those dead horses there, they hauled them in flat wagons, and he skinned them. And they took the hides and buried them there on that 20 acres. They say there was hundreds of horses buried right on that farm. And that's the place where Ray Miller lived. And this Charlie Tillman had a helper by the name of Dan Lebo. Skinned horses, helped him to skin horses.
And he could even sit on a horse and eat his lunch, couldn't he?
They said all the tools he needed was a fifth of whiskey and a sharp knife.
Well, I think you're doing something. Stand the smell. Now, that takes us through World War I and up to about 1920. And Mr. Guyton still was somewhat in the business, but I guess maybe he was out, but he still had lots of affiliations.
Harrington.
I mean Harrington, I didn't mean Guyton, because Mr. Guyton's down at the New Bach Hotel. Anyway, Bill was just a young man, 19 years old, and he wanted to make a trip to Europe. And so Mr. Harrington made arrangements with a mule company in St. Louis for him to take this trip, and also Dick Blackwood went along. Dick Blackwood many years ago was the assessor, surveyor for this county. So Dick and Bill went to Italy, and he'll tell you a little bit about that. And then just a few days or maybe a week or so, or 14 days maybe it was, huh? Douglas went on a different trip. He went to Spain, and they were nursemaids to Mules on the way over, and they'll tell you what a job it was and how much money they made and where all they went. Bill went first and got back to New York and left Dick Blackwood there waiting for his folks to wire him some money, and he caught a freight train home, and all he had to eat was bananas on the way because that's all the money he had left. And he gave the rest of his money to Dick Blackwood to wait until his parents sent him money. And he went to Coney Island and spent it all, and then he ran into Douglas and his crew as they were just going to go down to their ship, I presume, or anyway, you had a day. So they just passed in New York, which was a coincidence that you could run into somebody you knew in New York. So Bill, you went first, so we'll let you talk first.
Well, the highlight was my trip to New York.
Riding on a train.
On a caboose. Had an extra caboose on the train, 2 engines, and they pulled these mules. They unloaded them at Pittsburgh. You had to unload them every so often to feed them and water them. And then we took the freighter Alberta to Italy, Naples, Italy. Stayed with the ship and cruised around different islands and so forth. It was a very interesting trip.
You're supposed to tell what you did with the mules.
Well, there was no big chore. We
Fed and watered them.
Fed and watered them was all we had to do. Nothing else. And
Only lost one. This one died on
yeah,
the trip?
one died on the trip. Well, but it was a very interesting trip. We came home on their President line, on the President Wilson. Yeah. Nice ship.
We found in our possessions a card he had written from Pittsburgh, I think it is. He wasn't on his way back, he was just on his way over, and he said, gee, I think I could make it home for about $25. Well, I believe you could do that now. Anyway, this is 60 years old. It was 1928. Now, Douglas, you can tell about, you took yours to Spain, and Bill thought the Italian government was going to use the mules.
Yeah, saved it there for it.
Well, there's a Spanish man that bought the mules that we took 225, and there's 4 of us that fed them and took care of them all the way. And of course, on the way, as Bill said, on the way to Jersey City where we unloaded them, they had to stop and feed them a time or two, because it's too long to keep them from feeding on that trip. And we loaded them onto a barge, and then went out into the bay someplace there, and lowered them on the Julia, the ship. And it took us 14 days to get to Valencia, Spain. And we unloaded them there. And then the next day we started for Naples, Italy. And we had to clean the ship out.
We didn't have to do that.
We had the work of cleaning out the ship.
Well, how much pay did you receive?
We got $1 a day.
That's what we got. But we only
They had $14 when they got
14
there.
days what I had, yes.
$14.
Did you all clean the ship after them?
No, I didn't, but Doug did. He was a sucker.
Well, we wanted to get to Naples, really, was the reason we did that.
You were
Because
right now.
Swearingen, Reverend Swearingen, was one of the men that went. And he was the preacher at Lathrop. And his main idea of making this trip was to make a cruise around the Mediterranean Sea and go to Jerusalem. So that's what we did after we got to Naples. We bought passage on the ship and went around the sea to Jerusalem, several places.
We went to the island of Malta, which was a very interesting place.
You didn't come back on the same ship.
No, we came back on the President Wilson
It was a freighter.
night ship
Was it more or less a freighter you went over on?
on the Alberta, yeah.
On the Alberta.
They impounded it during the World War.
But he came
During
home
the
on
Second World
a
War.
beautiful ocean liner, and because he was classed as a crew, he could go anywhere on the ship, and he did. He'd go up there where all the elite were and dance with a German lady who could speak perfect English, but she didn't know it. She says, how does it sound? And he said, perfect, you just speak it beautifully. Well, the only other thing I have to add, and then if you have any questions you'd like to ask, I cut this out of the paper, and it's a twin, little twin mules, is that what you call it?
Yeah.
Twin, born to this mare down around Liberty, Missouri. And the interesting thing to me was the man that owns it is Willie Brashears, and I went to school with Willie Brashears. Do you remember, Esther, that he was in our class? And I knew Willis would remember that, but I'm sure it's the same Willie Brashears. But anyway, it's only 1 in 10,000 times this would happen. So I think that, and they're beautiful little mules. Are there any questions you would like to ask? I don't know if we could answer them, but, and this is a picture of some of the English, this is the British, some of the British men here, and then these are local, pretty much local men in back. Oh, one thing, I thought, Bill, you were going to tell about the Englishman who rode his horse in to get his mail.
You're telling me.
I'm telling, okay, I'll tell you. This, they were a little bit arrogant, I guess you might say. This Englishman wanted his mail, and he just drove in, and the post office had a large opening, door opening, so he just rode right in on his horse and asked for his mail. Well, they arrested him. They didn't think that, Lathrop didn't go for that.
He had a few drinks. Is that-
They had, well, that sounds good.
Anna Mae, I was gonna ask Bill or Douglas, I didn't understand the boat. Did you have the mules on the lower deck? Was that where they were?
They're down
And
in
you
the
all
hold.
were, yeah. And then you all were up
Yes.
above where your sleeping quarters
Yes.
were, and you were fed there.
Yes.
It got pretty smelly by the end of 14 days. Is
Well, no, it wasn't bad.
that right?
They never cleaned it out, though. Until they, I guess, after they got there. No, yeah. They never cleaned it out at all.
And then you helped clean it,
No, I didn't.
We
But Doug
did.
did.
but Douglas did.
The reason we did that, we were in Valencia, Spain, and we wanted to get around to Naples in order to get a passage around the Mediterranean Sea as we planned. So we got that extra ride, and we
Yeah.
cleaned the ship out.
They kept you busy.
Yeah, and two of the boys, there's 4 of us, 2 of them went to New York City and around up in Europe.
Would you just throw it off the side?
No, we spread a big canvas down with ropes at each corner, and we scooped on there, and then they pulled it up, dropped it over the side.
You only lost one mule on you, in your, they only lost each, I think that's record, that only one died, and they just dump it over in the ocean. That's the way they get rid of it.
Well, they had to take it care of.
The fish would eat it up.
Now, another thing I wanted to know, what did the residents around in the community that were really not involved with this business, what did they think about this?
You mean in Lathrop?
Yes.
Well, they weren't too enthusiastic about it.
Flowers.
But it was business. But it was business.
Gardens and their lawns
Made
and yards
made
and
it
everything.
employment for
I
everybody.
wouldn't think they'd be
Just
too
wanted to work.
enthusiastic.
Lathrop was a town of 2,000 at that time, and we've been down to 1,000 in just a few years back. We are up to 1,700 now. But there were lots of businesses, lots of restaurants, several grocery stores, and of course bonnet factories and blacksmith shops, and all sorts of business, poultry houses and things that.
Where did the Bolton people stay? That, like the English that came over here, like
Well,
did they board or did they go to the city?
They had a barracks. I intended to touch on that, but I tell you, I couldn't.
Oh, they had places that they stayed
They
in
had
farm.
a small barracks. If you know where the cross houses, there's 5 in a row.
Right.
Right behind that was a barracks that, not the officers, they didn't stay there, but these other men that they brought in that were, helpers, stayed in that. And it had a screened-in porch around it. And they would have dances on the weekends. I guess they'd have women or wives or whoever.
What was the price of these mules that they paid these farmers? Do you know what the price?
Papa got $1,500, one team he has. $1,500.
They sold well.
I know my
There's
dad
lots
sold.
Lots of mules is bringing $250 a head, depending on what type of a mule they was wanting at that particular time.
My dad sold over a mule that they would buy.
Horses, that's right. More horses.
What did you say?
My dad sold every mule that they would buy. We had one with a crippled foot. And I was 57 days old when war was declared. So I don't remember much about it, but I worked that mule with a crippled foot till I was 17 years old. He died. He was the only one that didn't go to the war.
Well, they made lots of money, and they lived on that, and their children and their grandchildren, and even on down to present day, I think they all, they're still, they were well-to-do people. They owned a lot of.
I had a picture, and I couldn't find it. My dad had of Main Street full of mules, solid. Of course, it was a dirt street, mud, and wet and muddy one time, and dusty in the summer.
Dusty in the summer,
Sure. I don't know where the picture was actually taken from, but it shows the entire Main Street of Lathrop full of mules and horses, or horses.
Well, Douglas is, we were talking about this at the house the other day, about the ruts, they bring those wagons and mules, and the town would just, I just can't imagine how awesome. And they had a big trough for water, where the townspeople got water, didn't they, there right at the...
They had 2 wells.
At the intersection. Lathrop's been known for their artesian wells. They had wonderful. We're getting it out of Kansas City, Missouri River now.
Well, now, there aren't any remnants of the barn.
Not now.
Not now.
They're all
The
gone.
last barn, I have a picture here.
1957.
I remember. Now, this is
Between Plattsburgh and Lathrop, I knew it was.
Last one to burn.
This was the last one to burn, and it was called the Smith Barn, and it was built in 1902 and burned August 3rd, 1957. And
Mary
this
Missy's
is
got pictures of that during
during the burning. I know a few people have. This was the largest mule barn in the world and was in Ripley's, believe it or not. This is the picture if you want to pass that around. And I want to thank Maria Harrington for loaning her book, and Betty May brought her book. I think it's really hard to fathom when you look through these how big, how deep those fields, pastures were. And you see this first of this is just Lathrop. They had the same thing in Nashville, Tennessee, Columbia, Tennessee, and in Louisiana. They had huge, huge barns where this wasn't the only place they had them, but Lathrop seemed to have been the biggest.
What was the biggest population of mules they would ever have there at one time? Did anybody have any idea?
At one time, 53,000 was what...
53?
53, they said at one time, 53,000. I have it here somewhere. Well, that's quite a few.
Oh, my, yeah.
And took a lot of care.
I might tell you this, where you call them the cross houses, those houses were built by Guyton and Harrington for the people to live in.
I'm going to correct you. They're built by J.D. Guyton.
Is that who built them? And they were built,
Harrington had nothing to do with it.
well, okay, but anyway, they were built for the people to live in. The buyers, not necessarily the buyers, but the people from England,
You've
wasn't
been
it?
misled.
Not those.
Those
were
5
the
little
ones-
houses were built
I helped wire 'em.
Oh, no,
built
that's,
afterwards, and Mr. Guyton just built them for tenant houses.
Well, they tore down, I was getting ready to tell you that, they tore down these barracks and used part of that lumber to build those 5 houses with.
Yeah.
And Betty May, you own one of the houses, don't you? Don't you own that north? Not now. Okay. But anyway, they, after they had no longer use for them, And Bill remembers skating on this, where these barracks, there was a porch all around them, and he and some of his friends would roller skate there, I guess, on bad days. Or
That's
maybe
after
didn't-
they used it.
maybe-
They didn't use it anymore.
After it was used, yeah, I mean, after the use of it was no longer needed.
And did Guyton and Harrington live in Lathrop before they started this business, or did they come to Lathrop?
No, the South. You missed that little bit,
Yes, I
that
did.
very first that I said.
It's hard to hear back here.
They came from Alabama and Mississippi in a southern people. And that's how they just realized the potential of this grassy.
Do you have diesel books to sell?
No, but there's one in the library over there. Bill,
But there isn't anybody that sells these.
no. Our son had those made to give to for Christmas presents. BH had a whole bunch of those made, and I just happen to have 4 of them left, and I'm going to donate some to our library, and I have donated one here.
Anna Mae, a lot of us here know Thelma Van Buren and remember Louis well, and I want to know what he had to do with this business.
I think he could tell you better than I. He was a foreman, I think, wasn't he? Feed foreman.
He worked for Guyton and Harrington.
That was my understanding that he was people.
He and his wife, now you meant to correct me on this, one of these, I think they lived in a little tenant house when they were first married in this number 13, 11 or 13, whichever one. He was one of the caretakers of a certain, see there's barns.
Did they bring him
sheds
here?
on
Did they
every single one of
import
these.
Louis?
I don't know. I think he came out of the Illinois, but I'm not
That's what I thought.
sure.
That's where his family.
That's what I'm at.
Wasn't she an extension agent here and then?
Oh, but that was way after that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's just,
All right,
I even remember that.
He was married,
okay,
he was married before.
See, this was a previous wife,
right, okay.
Oh, yes, she was married 4 years,
many years back. Betty made this map for me, and I do want to thank you, because I think it shows the scope of this. See, this is Lathrop, and it's a mile square, and here are all these other farms that they leased, I presume. I don't think they owned all this, did they? They didn't, they just leased it. And they also, I'm sure, had land leased around Plattsburgh and Cherney. And in this book, Jack Stock, Mules in Missouri, they mention Newby and Jackson as buyers of mules and horses, and also some Blands and Gower and Parkville. They have another, this tells the whole state of Missouri, all the people that raised stock. But they have quite a big section in here about Guyton and Harrington. So this is where part of my information came from.
Anna Mae, may I see that book, please?
This one?
There's another mule graveyard or horse graveyard out northwest of the old big barn that burned. And there's a graveyard there, and it's kind of interesting. And everybody knows Norman Tate here at Plattsburgh. And Norman was digging up water line for McGinnis. He's digging through there, and he dug into a bunch of bones. He come up out of that ditch. Them mules, they may be all mule bones, but they don't all look like mule bones to me. He wouldn't dig anymore.
Ready to run onto one of his cousins, huh? Well, we'll answer any other questions if we have any, if we can.
We certainly thank you for a very good program. Our next meeting will be in 2 months. May, and it'll be on the second Saturday at 2 o'clock here. And as Dorothy told you, the lady from Weston will be with us. If there's no further business, the meeting is adjourned.